For 6 years, they used my propane. For 6 years, they heated their fancy clubhouse, their pool, their outdoor grills at every HOA party, all on my dime. For 6 years, not one single person said thank you, not one check, not one knock on my door, nothing. And when I finally found out the truth, when I saw exactly how much they had stolen from me, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't file a complaint. I walked outside at 2 in the morning, in my pajamas, with a wrench in my hand, and I shut it all down. Every single valve, every single line, gone. And what happened next changed everything about that neighborhood forever. My name is Raymond Calhoun. I am 61 years old. I spent 34 years working as a pipefitter for a natural gas company in central Tennessee. I know more about gas lines, propane systems, pressure valves, and underground piping than most licensed contractors in this entire state. When I retired in 2018, my wife Clara and I decided we wanted peace. We wanted quiet mornings on a porch. We wanted a garden. We wanted neighbors who waved at you when you drove by instead of filing complaints about your mailbox being 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. So we found Maplewood Estates, a gated community about 40 minutes outside of Nashville, manicured lawns, a beautiful clubhouse, a community pool that shimmered in the summer heat like something out of a magazine. We fell in love with it the moment we drove through the front gates. The house we bought was on the far western edge of the community. It sat on almost 3/4 of an acre, which was significantly larger than most of the other lots in Maplewood. The previous owners had installed a massive above-ground propane tank on the side of the property, one of those large commercial-grade white tanks that holds about 500 gallons. They used it to heat the house, fuel the kitchen range, and power a backup generator. When we bought the property, that tank came with it. We transferred the service account into our name, set up automatic refills with a local propane supplier, and thought nothing more about it. It was just part of the house, part of the property, ours. What we did not know, what nobody told us at closing, what no disclosure document mentioned, what our real estate agent apparently had no idea about, was that somewhere, buried underneath the gravel path that ran along the western fence line of our property, there was a secondary gas line. And that line did not run into our house. It ran in the opposite direction. It ran under the fence. It ran across the common area lawn. And it connected, quietly and secretly, directly into the clubhouse next door. We lived there for almost a year before I even noticed anything unusual. It was a Saturday morning in late October. I was doing some yard work near the propane tank, and I happened to glance at the gauge. We had filled it completely just 3 weeks earlier. It should have been sitting at around 80%. Instead, it was reading 52%. I stood there for a moment thinking I had miscalculated. I went inside and checked my calendar. No, I was right. Full tank 3 weeks ago. We had not been using extra heat. The weather had been mild. Clara and I had actually been traveling for one of those 3 weeks, visiting our son in Colorado. The house had been completely empty. There was no reason for that much propane to have been consumed. I told myself it was probably a slow leak somewhere in the system. I called the propane company and asked them to send someone out to do a pressure check. The technician came out 2 days later, walked the line from the tank to the house, checked every connection, tested every valve. He told me everything looked fine on the house side. No leaks, no pressure drops. System was operating perfectly. He scratched his head. I scratched mine. We both shrugged and went on with our lives. But the gauge kept dropping faster than it should. By December, I had refilled the tank twice, in a single month. For a house with 2 people, mild winter temperatures, and a newer high-efficiency furnace that made absolutely no sense. My propane bill for November and December alone was over $900. For comparison, our neighbors across the street, same size house, same number of people, told me they spent about $250 total for that same period. I was spending nearly 4 times what I should have been. I started keeping a detailed log. Every morning I walked outside and wrote down the tank gauge reading in a small notebook. I noted the outdoor temperature. I noted whether we had used the range for cooking, whether the furnace had cycled frequently, whether the generator had run. I tracked everything, and what I saw in that log made my blood run cold. On the days when the clubhouse was hosting events, holiday parties, HOA meetings, neighborhood gatherings, my propane usage spiked dramatically. On quiet weekdays, when nothing was happening at the clubhouse, my usage was perfectly normal. I did not want to believe what I was starting to suspect. I told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe there was some kind of pressure fluctuation in the system. Maybe the gauge was malfunctioning. Maybe I was reading too much into the data. I am an engineer by trade and training. I believe in facts. I believe in evidence. I told myself I needed more before I started making accusations. So I installed a flow meter. I ordered it online, a high-quality digital gas flow meter that could be installed inline on the main supply line coming out of the tank. It would give me precise readings of exactly how much gas was flowing through the system at any given moment. I installed it myself on a Tuesday afternoon. It took me about 45 minutes. I calibrated it, tested it, confirmed it was reading accurately against our known house consumption. Then I waited. The following Saturday, the HOA was hosting their annual Winter Wonderland party at the clubhouse. I knew because we had received the invitation in our mailbox like everyone else. I watched families and couples walking across the common area in their holiday sweaters. I could smell food cooking from our back porch. I could hear music and laughter drifting over the fence. It sounded like a wonderful time. I was not focused on the party, though. I was focused on my flow meter. The reading was extraordinary. At peak party time, between 6 and 9 in the evening, my system was pushing out gas at a rate that was roughly 4 times my entire house's normal maximum consumption. At 9 o'clock, I walked back inside and sat down at my kitchen table. Clara asked me what was wrong. I showed her my notebook. I showed her the flow meter readings. I showed her 6 weeks of data. She covered her mouth with her hand. Someone was tapping into my propane tank, and based on the direction of the flow and the timing of the usage, that someone was the Maplewood Estates HOA clubhouse. The next morning I called a licensed plumber who also did gas line work. His name was Terry Baskins, and I had used him before for some work on our kitchen. I told him I suspected there was an unauthorized secondary line coming off my tank. I asked him to come out and do a full underground survey. He brought a line locating device and spent about 3 hours walking the property. What he found confirmed everything. It was a secondary copper line, installed professionally and buried about 18 inches underground, running from a T-connection on my main supply line, along the western fence, under the fence panel, and into the crawl space of the clubhouse. Terry estimated the line was at least 10 to 15 years old based on the fittings and the type of copper used. This was not something that had been installed recently. This had been there for a long, long time, long before Clara and I had ever moved in. Terry gave me a written report. He photographed everything. He documented the T-connection, the routing of the line, the point of entry into the clubhouse. He also told me something that made my jaw drop. The connection had been made professionally. This was not some backyard amateur job. Someone with real knowledge of gas line work had installed this system. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who knew that if you tapped into a residential propane supply line from a residential tank, the homeowner's propane account would be billed for all of it, and the homeowner would have no easy way of knowing. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything. I needed to think clearly. I needed to be certain. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before I took any action, because I could feel the anger building inside me like pressure in a sealed tank, and I knew if I acted too quickly or too emotionally, I would make mistakes. So I started calculating. I pulled 6 years of propane bills. I had kept every single one because I keep meticulous financial records. I went through each bill and I compared our actual usage to what our usage should have been based on the size of our home, our thermostat settings, the number of occupants, and the regional climate data for Middle Tennessee. The difference, the amount of propane consumed beyond what our house should have used, was staggering. Over 6 years, the Maplewood Estates HOA clubhouse had consumed approximately 4,800 gallons of propane from my tank. At average propane prices over that period, that worked out to roughly $14,000. $14,000 of my money. Gone. Used to heat their parties, warm their meetings, fuel their outdoor grills, power their patio heaters. All while Clara and I paid every single bill without question because we assumed we were just paying for our own home. $14,000. I'm not a wealthy man. I'm a retired pipefitter living on a pension and Social Security. $14,000 is not nothing to me. $14,000 is a year of grocery bills. It is 2 years of property taxes. It is the money I had been slowly setting aside to replace the roof on our house. $14,000 that I worked for, that Clara and I earned and saved and budgeted around, had been quietly and consistently stolen from us for 6 years. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Osei. She had an office about 20 minutes from our house, and she specialized in property disputes and neighbor law. I sat across from her desk with my notebook, my flow meter data, Terry Baskins's written report, and 6 years of propane bills. I laid everything out in front of her in organized chronological order. She spent about 20 minutes reading through it. When she looked up at me, her expression was one I recognized. The expression of someone who cannot quite believe what they are seeing even though the evidence is right in front of them. She told me I had an extremely strong case. She said what the HOA had done constituted unauthorized use of private property, theft of services, and potentially unjust enrichment. She said the fact that the installation had been done professionally and deliberately, and that it had continued for years, would likely be viewed very seriously by a court. She advised me to document everything further, to get a second independent assessment of the gas line installation, and to hold off on confronting the HOA directly until we had a complete picture of what we were dealing with. I followed her advice. I hired a second gas line contractor who confirmed everything Terry had found. I had the flow meter data professionally analyzed by an engineering consultant who put together a detailed report on the usage patterns and confirmed that the excess consumption was consistent with commercial heating and cooking use rather than residential. I built my file carefully and methodically over the following 3 weeks. And then, with my lawyer's blessing, I made one final decision. Before I filed anything, before I sent any letters, before I did anything official or legal or formal, I was going to shut off their gas. Not because it was the smartest strategic move. Patricia actually advised against it from a purely legal standpoint, but I am 61 years old. I spent 34 years working in heat and cold and rain and mud so that I could retire with some dignity, and something inside me needed to feel the moment when I personally, physically, with my own hands, took back what was mine. I needed that moment for myself, not for the court, not for the record, for me. So on a Tuesday night in February at 2:15 in the morning, when the neighborhood was completely silent and dark, I put on my work boots. I picked up my wrench. I walked across the frost-covered grass to the side of my house where that white tank stood in the dark like a silent witness to 6 years of theft, and I found the secondary supply valve, the one that fed the line running under my fence, and I closed it. Then I found the T-connection Terry had documented, and I capped it off properly. Then I walked the fence line to where the line crossed under, and I cut it cleanly and capped that end too. Proper fittings, pressure tested, done correctly, the way a 34-year pipefitter does things. Then I walked back inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table in the dark and quiet of my own house, and felt something I had not felt since the day I first looked at that flow meter reading. I felt peace. Clara found me still sitting there when she came downstairs at 6 in the morning. She looked at my work boots. She looked at my coffee cup. She looked at my face. She said simply, "Did you do it?" I said, "Yes." She sat down across from me, wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug, and said, "Good." The following Thursday, the Maplewood Estates HOA had their monthly board meeting scheduled at the clubhouse. I know this because it was posted on the neighborhood website and because meeting notices had been slipped under every door on the street as usual. 47 homeowners typically attended these meetings, or at least that was the average attendance based on the sign-in sheets I had seen posted publicly in previous months. I did not attend the meeting. Clara and I sat on our back porch that evening with cups of tea and listened to the night sounds of the neighborhood. At around 7:15, about 45 minutes into what should have been a 2-hour meeting, I heard voices, raised voices, coming from the direction of the clubhouse, then more voices, then what sounded like a fairly heated argument, then the sound of the clubhouse doors opening and people filing out much earlier than expected. The meeting had ended at 7:30, 2.5 hours early. The next morning I found 3 voicemails on my phone. The first was from the HOA president, a man named Gerald Pratt. His message was clipped and formal. He said there had been an issue with the clubhouse heating system and that the board would be looking into it and that he wanted to speak with me at my convenience. The second voicemail was from a board member named Sheila Voss. She said essentially the same thing, but in a warmer tone, adding that she hoped everything was all right with me and Clara and asking me to call her back. The third voicemail was from a man I did not recognize, who identified himself as a maintenance contractor hired by the HOA, asking if I had noticed any issues with my gas service recently. I did not return any of the calls. Instead, that morning, Patricia Osai's office sent 3 certified letters, one to Gerald Pratt as HOA president, one to the full HOA board at their registered address, and one to the property management company that handled administrative functions for Maplewood Estates. Each letter was identical in content. Each letter outlined the unauthorized gas line connection, the documentation we had gathered, the estimated theft of $14,000 in propane over 6 years, and our formal demand for full restitution plus attorney fees plus damages. Each letter included copies of Terry Baskins's report, the engineering consultant's analysis, 6 years of annotated propane bills, and the flow meter data. Each letter also included a single clear statement at the end. The secondary gas line that had been illegally connected to my private propane tank has been permanently disconnected. Any attempt to reconnect to my system, access my property for any purpose related to this matter, or retaliate against me or my wife in any form will result in immediate escalation to criminal charges. I stood at my mailbox and watched the mail carrier drive away with those 3 envelopes. Then I went back inside and made breakfast. Gerald Pratt knocked on my door 2 hours later. I had been expecting him. I opened the door, looked at him calmly, and said nothing. Gerald Pratt was 64 years old. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending a lot of time on a golf course. He had been HOA president for 11 years. Before that, he had been a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. He was the kind of man who had spent his entire career learning how to be persuasive, how to make people feel heard while simultaneously steering them toward whatever outcome he had already decided on. I had dealt with men like Gerald Pratt my entire working life. I was not impressed by him. He told me there had been a misunderstanding. He said the gas line connection had been installed years ago, long before either of us had moved into the neighborhood, and that the board had actually been completely unaware of it. He said he understood why I was upset. He said the HOA wanted to make this right. He used the phrase, "make this right," 4 times in the first 3 minutes. I let him talk. I did not interrupt. I did not respond with anger. I just listened with my arms crossed and my expression neutral. When he finished, I said one sentence. "My lawyer will be in touch." Then I closed the door. The week after Patricia's letters arrived at HOA headquarters, Maplewood Estates descended into something I can only describe as controlled chaos, and I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my own property with a kind of detached satisfaction that surprised even me. The first sign that things were unraveling inside the board was a neighborhood-wide email that went out on a Friday evening. It came from Gerald Pratt's official HOA president account, and it said, in vague and carefully lawyered language, that the board was currently investigating a maintenance discrepancy related to the clubhouse utility systems and that all homeowners would be updated in due course. It said nothing specific. It named no one. It acknowledged no wrongdoing. It was the kind of email that is designed to say as little as possible while still technically saying something. Within 2 hours of that email going out, my phone began ringing. Not from board members this time, from neighbors, people I knew by name but not particularly well, people who had seen me wave from my driveway and wave back, but who had never had much reason to knock on my door. They had read between the lines of Gerald's carefully worded email, and the neighborhood rumor mill had apparently already been running at full speed since the clubhouse meeting had ended early 3 days before. The first neighbor to call was a woman named Donna Sherwood who lived 4 houses down from us. Donna was a retired nurse, sharp and practical, with no patience for nonsense. She asked me directly what was going on. I told her that I had an ongoing legal matter and that I was not able to discuss the details, but that she would likely hear more information soon. She paused for a moment and then said, "It's about the clubhouse gas, isn't it?" It was not a question. I said again that I could not discuss it. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh and said, "I knew something was wrong with those utility bills. I always knew." Then she thanked me and hung up. 3 more neighbors called that evening with similar conversations. By Saturday morning, the neighborhood Facebook group, which I did not participate in but which Clara monitored on my behalf, had erupted into a lengthy thread. People were speculating, people were asking questions, people were angry, though at first they were not entirely sure what they were angry about. Gerald had made a post in the group attempting to reassure everyone that the matter was being handled professionally and that there was no cause for concern. That post received 47 comments within 90 minutes, most of them demanding specific answers. Patricia called me Saturday afternoon to let me know the HOA's attorney had reached out to her office, requesting a call to discuss options for resolution. Patricia's tone, when she said this, was the tone of a lawyer who has seen this exact moment many times and knows exactly what it means. It means they are scared. It means their own legal counsel has read the documentation we sent and told them the situation is very bad. It means they want to settle quietly and quickly before this becomes something larger and more public and more damaging. Patricia asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted every penny of that $14,000. I told her I wanted it documented in a formal written agreement. I told her I wanted the HOA to pay my legal fees. And I told her I wanted a formal written acknowledgement of what had happened, not a vague settlement agreement with mutual non-disparagement clauses, but an actual written acknowledgement that an unauthorized connection had been made to my private property and that the HOA was responsible for the resulting theft of my propane over a period of 6 years. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the acknowledgement would be the hardest thing to get them to agree to because it exposed the board and potentially individual board members to further liability. She said most attorneys in this situation would push hard for a confidential settlement with no admission of wrongdoing. I told her that was their problem, not mine. She said, "All right, Raymond, I'll go to bat for everything you're asking for." The following Monday, Clara and I drove to Patricia's office and spent 3 hours reviewing documents and strategy. Patricia laid out the full legal picture in clear terms. Civil liability for the unauthorized use of my property was straightforward and very strong. The question of whether individual board members had known about the gas line was more complicated. Gerald had claimed the board was unaware of it, which was possible. The installation appeared to be at least 10 to 12 years old based on the materials, which predated the current board composition. However, Patricia pointed out, even if the current board had not installed the line, they had a fiduciary duty to the HOA and to the community, and their continued use of my resources without investigation or disclosure once they became aware of any utility anomalies was potentially actionable. More importantly, Patricia had done some additional research into the property history of Maplewood Estates. What she had found was interesting. The HOA had undergone a significant internal reorganization about 8 years ago. Prior to that reorganization, a previous board president named Harold Sims had overseen a major renovation of the clubhouse, which had included the installation of a commercial-grade heating system and kitchen upgrade. Patricia had pulled the renovation permits from the county. The permits listed a licensed gas line contractor. Patricia had tracked down that contractor, who was now retired but still reachable. He confirmed that he had installed a secondary gas supply line as part of the renovation. He had been told by Harold Sims, who had since moved away from Maplewood, that the connection was authorized by the property owner of the adjacent lot. He had assumed the paperwork was in order. He had a signed work order from Sims and had assumed the rest was handled. So the picture became clearer. Harold Sims, the previous board president, had authorized an unauthorized connection to whoever owned my property before us, had apparently told the contractor it was legitimate, and had presumably been getting free propane for the clubhouse for years before he moved away. When he left, the new board had inherited the clubhouse, inherited the utilities, and had either not known about the secondary gas line at all, or had known and said nothing. Either way, the result was the same: my propane, my money, gone. We were 3 weeks into the legal process when something happened that shifted the entire dynamics of the situation in a way I had not anticipated. A homeowner named Frank Castellano submitted a formal records request to the HOA board. Frank was an accountant, meticulous and persistent, and he had apparently been suspicious of HOA finances for some time. His records request covered 5 years of HOA utility bills, maintenance invoices, and vendor contracts. Under Tennessee law, HOA members have the right to inspect certain association financial records, and the board was legally required to comply. What Frank found in those records, and what he shared with Patricia after she reached out to him, was that the HOA's own utility records showed the clubhouse had been operating on an extraordinarily low gas budget for years. The board had been allocating almost nothing to clubhouse gas costs in their annual budget because they had almost no gas costs, because they were using mine. Frank traced the numbers back through 5 years of available records and confirmed that the HOA had been saving an estimated $2,000 to $3,000 per year in clubhouse energy costs. Costs that should have appeared in their budget, but never did because the expense was being silently offloaded to my propane account. That money had to have gone somewhere in the budget. Frank found it. It had been quietly absorbed into what the budget listed as a general maintenance reserve that had never been itemized or audited. Over 5 years, that reserve had accumulated over $12,000 beyond what standard maintenance costs would account for. Frank had questions about where that money had gone. So did Patricia. Gerald Pratt was now in a very uncomfortable position. His attorney called Patricia 3 more times that week. The calls became progressively less formal and more urgent. By the 3rd call, the tone had shifted from "let's discuss options" to "what would it take to make this go away?" Patricia's answer was the same every time: full restitution of $14,000, legal fees, written acknowledgement. Gerald's attorney pushed back on the acknowledgement. They offered confidential settlement. They offered confidential settlement with a slightly higher dollar amount. They offered confidential settlement with the higher dollar amount and an HOA fee waiver for 5 years. Patricia brought each offer to me. I rejected each one. "I want the acknowledgement," I told her each time. "That is not negotiable." Here is why that was so important to me. Because I had done the math on something beyond just my own situation. The house on my western boundary, directly behind mine with shared fence line access to the same common area, had also been occupied by various owners over the years. I had learned from my neighbors that this property had changed hands 4 times in the past decade. 4 different families had lived in that house. None of them had known about the gas line either, according to what Patricia had gathered. But the previous lot on the other side of mine, I had also done some checking. That lot had a propane tank too, and an older, grandfathered line that ran along the same fence route. I had a strong suspicion that my situation was not unique. I had a strong suspicion that Harold Sims had been creative with multiple properties. And if I signed a confidential settlement with no acknowledgement, none of that would ever come to light. I wanted the acknowledgement because I wanted the truth on record, not just for myself, for whoever came after me, for whoever was currently living in one of those other houses and wondering why their propane bills seemed too high. Clara said it best one evening when we were sitting on the porch and I was explaining my thinking to her. She listened to me lay out the whole strategy, and when I finished, she just nodded and said, "You're not just doing this for us, are you?" I said no, I was not. She said, "Good. Harold Sims has been gone for years, but his mess is still hurting people. Someone needs to put it on paper." 6 weeks after Patricia sent those initial certified letters, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Unlike their regular meetings, this one was not posted publicly. It was not listed on the neighborhood website. No notices were slipped under doors, but Frank Castellano found out about it. He had a friend on the board who was deeply uncomfortable with the direction things were going, and Frank told Patricia, and Patricia told me. The board was considering two paths. Path one was to continue resisting the acknowledgement and take the matter to civil court, betting that a judge would ultimately approve a confidential resolution and that the acknowledgement could be avoided. Path two was to accept our terms, issue the acknowledgement, pay the restitution, and deal with the internal fallout. The vote was 3-2 in favor of Path 2. Gerald Pratt was one of the two who voted against. He was outvoted by his own board. Patricia called me the morning after the meeting with the news. She was professional and calm as always, but I could hear something underneath the professionalism, something that might have been satisfaction. She told me the board's attorney had contacted her that morning and was ready to discuss final terms. She told me she expected we could have a signed agreement within 2 weeks. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat in the dark at 2 in the morning with my coffee cup and my work boots after shutting off the valves. The same table where Clara had sat across from me and said good. I called Clara in from the garden and told her. She wiped her hands on her gardening gloves, sat down across from me, and let out a long, slow breath. 14,000, she said. Plus legal fees, I said, plus the acknowledgement. She nodded slowly, then she said, what about Harold Sims? I told her that was the next conversation, that Patricia was already looking into whether there were grounds for a separate action against Sims personally for the original unauthorized installation, that it was complicated because he had moved out of state and because proving his personal knowledge versus the HOA's institutional responsibility would require more investigation, but that it was not off the table. She said, good. The formal settlement agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon at Patricia's office. Gerald Pratt did not attend. He sent the board's attorney as his representative. 3 other board members were present in person. They looked tired. They looked like people who had spent 6 weeks dealing with consequences they had not created but had inherited and then made worse by initially trying to avoid accountability. I did not feel sorry for them, but I did not feel contempt for them either. Most of them had not known. Most of them had simply been trying to protect the association they were responsible for without fully understanding the scope of what had happened or the right way to handle it. They had made the mistake of listening to Gerald Pratt for too long. The settlement included the full $14,000 in restitution. It included $2,200 in legal fees. It included a formal written acknowledgement, signed by the HOA board, stating that an unauthorized gas supply line had been installed connecting the Maplewood Estates clubhouse to the private propane system of my property, that this connection had resulted in the unauthorized consumption of propane paid for by me and by previous owners of my property, and that the HOA accepted responsibility for the resulting financial harm and expressed formal regret for the impact this had on me and my family. I read that acknowledgement 3 times before I signed the settlement. I read every word of it. I wanted it in my memory. When we were done and the papers were all signed and the attorneys were exchanging copies and the board members were quietly gathering their things, one of them, a younger woman named Angela Park, who had only been on the board for about 18 months, approached me as I was putting on my coat. She said, Mr. Calhoun, I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry. I know that doesn't change anything that happened, but I want you to know that not everyone on that board knew, and not everyone on that board is proud of how this was handled. I looked at her for a moment. She seemed sincere. She seemed like someone who had gotten herself into a situation she had not anticipated when she volunteered to serve on the HOA board. I said, I appreciate that, Angela, I really do, and I believe you, but here is what I need you to take away from this. When something does not add up, when the numbers don't make sense, when the bills seem wrong, when the budget has a line item that nobody can fully explain, follow it. Follow it all the way to the end, because the people who get hurt when nobody asks questions are usually the people who can least afford it. She nodded, she shook my hand, she walked out. The week after the settlement, the neighborhood finally got the full story, not from me, from Frank Castellano, who had every legal right to share what was in the public records he had obtained, and who had been waiting patiently for the legal process to conclude before saying anything. Frank posted a detailed fact-based summary in the neighborhood Facebook group. He laid out the gas line discovery, the propane theft, the settlement. He did not editorialize much. He did not have to. The facts spoke loudly enough on their own. The response was enormous. Some neighbors were angry at the board. Some were sympathetic to the board members who had not known. A few defended Gerald Pratt, arguing that the whole thing predated the current leadership and that the board had ultimately done the right thing by settling. Most people just seemed genuinely shocked that something like this had been happening quietly for so many years in their neighborhood. Gerald Pratt resigned as HOA president 11 days after the settlement was signed. His resignation letter was 3 sentences long and cited personal reasons. He remains a resident of Maplewood Estates. We do not speak. We wave when we pass each other on the street, the way neighbors in a quiet suburb wave at each other. Minimal, polite, sufficient. Angela Park was elected as the new HOA president at a special election held the following month. She won by an overwhelming margin. The first thing she did was commission a full audit of all HOA utility connections and infrastructure, including a survey of every line running through HOA common areas. The audit turned up 2 additional anomalies on properties elsewhere in the community, not gas lines, but unauthorized irrigation connections that had been quietly pulling water from private residential systems for years. Both of those homeowners were also compensated. I was not involved in those cases directly, but Patricia told me about them. She said the HOA's new board had apparently used our case as a template for how to handle the situations, promptly, transparently, with acknowledgement and full restitution. I told Patricia that was the best news I had heard since she called me with the settlement terms. She laughed. She said, "You know, most people in your position would have taken the confidential settlement the first time they offered it. The money was almost the same. It would have been faster." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the flow meter. I thought about the notebook I had kept every morning, walking out to that tank in the dark with a flashlight to read the gauge. I thought about Clara saying good. I thought about the 4 families who had lived in the house next door and never known why their bills were too high. I said, because somebody needed to put it on paper. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yeah, somebody did." Clara and I used part of the restitution money to replace the roof, which we had been putting off for 2 years. We used another part to take a trip to see our son in Colorado, a real trip this time, not a rushed weekend visit, but a full 10 days. We hiked. We cooked meals together. We sat on his porch in the evenings and watched the mountains turn pink in the sunset. On the last evening of that trip, sitting there in the mountain air with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I thought about 2:15 in the morning in February. I thought about the wrench in my hand and the frost on the grass and the absolute silence of a neighborhood asleep. I thought about closing those valves and capping those lines with the same hands that had spent 34 years working in gas and pipe. I thought about walking back inside and sitting down in the dark. There are moments in a life when you take something back that was taken from you, when you stop waiting for someone else to notice or intervene or fix it, when you do the thing yourself with your own hands in the way only you can do it. Those moments do not come often, but when they do, you remember them. I finished my coffee. The mountains were dark now. Inside, Clara was laughing at something our son had said. The sound carried out to the porch through the screen door. I thought about that white tank standing in the side yard back in Tennessee, solid, sealed, mine.